In this chapter, we're going to be looking at the compute resources in an Azure infrastructure. The compute resources represent either virtual machines in an IaaS environment, so infrastructure as a service, or app services and service plans, etc., in a platform as a service option. We're going to talk about designing and planning for Azure virtual machines. We'll walk through the steps to create and manage those virtual machines. We need to understand the different availability options so that we can ensure these VMs are highly available. And then we'll talk about just some advanced virtual machine management as well. Like virtual machine extensions and things like that. Then we'll get into some of the platform as a service, so app services and service plans, and some additional PaaS options in the use of containers as well, and those services, as well as the Kubernetes service, which is probably something that will be new to most of us. I know it was to me. But just understand those options that are out there and some of the high-level implementation steps on those options. So with any infrastructure, the deployment of compute resources, such as virtual machines, in the case of Azure, application service plans, container services, etc., is going to require an adequate amount of planning. In the infrastructure as a service, the responsibility is shared between the provider and the customer. But in IaaS, you actually have the majority of the responsibility falling on the shoulders of the customer. There will be certain things that as a customer we would never control, like the underlying infrastructure, the physical storage, the physical networking, things like that. But operating systems, the version and that you're running, and the functionality or the roles provided by that operating system are all managed by the customer. Network controls are all managed by the customer in an IaaS solution. So you're creating VNets and subnets and routing and the utilization of firewalls and network security groups, things of that nature. The applications that are available, always going to be a responsibility of the customer in an IaaS solution. Identity infrastructure, how do we create and manage user accounts and authenticate and authorize people? And then the information and data itself. Okay, so really the only thing that is the responsibility of the provider in an IaaS solution are the physical host, the physical network, and the physical data center needs. Everything having to do with the virtual machines is going to be our responsibility. So just like we would take time and care designing and planning machines in an on-prem infrastructure, we need to do the same thing in a cloud infrastructure. And that's not to say that some of these won't be a little different. Obviously, if you're in a cloud environment where you're, heavily using virtualization, there are going to be some differences, especially where you pay for what you're getting and you can manage different availability options and things like that. So it's going to be a bit different. My point was the responsibility still comes with us. Okay, so one thing to start prior to determining the specifics for individual compute resources, we need to diagram the proposed network solution. So we start with the network, the VNets. Those VNets are used to provide connectivity between Azure virtual machines and services. If you've got stuff that's on the same network, then they can access one another. But by default, if they're on different virtual networks, they cannot connect, right? Now, we do know that you can obviously provide that connection through VNet peering or with an on-prem network through the VPN gateway, but the point is start with the network configuration, kind of figure out where do we want these virtual machines and the general function that they're providing prior to trying to determine the actual, compute resources. Then we want to go and look at the naming conventions. Okay, this is something that often we don't put a whole lot of thought into, but it is very important. The VM name is used as the Windows VM name. So you can have a name of up to 15 characters in Windows, up to 64 characters if you are in Linux. So try to come up with some sort of naming convention. There can be multiple elements. There is not a right or wrong way here. We just don't want, server 1, server 2, server 3. Come up with some sort of designation that defines maybe the environment. Is it development or production? The location or the region? The instance, if there are actually more than one servers that are doing the same thing. The service, the role. So if it's a web server, we call it web. If it's SQL Server, we call it SQL. Those kinds of things. So just come up with a naming convention and utilize that naming convention. At that point, we want to determine the location of the compute resources. There's a couple of things to think about when you're dealing with the locations, okay? The ideal would be, or the very first thing is the latency to that particular location, okay? And most of that's pretty straightforward for us. So for instance, where I'm at, we choose by default North Central US for Azure resources, because if I go to the latency checker, my latency to the North Central US is going to that data center is going to be much less than everything else. Okay, now when I say much less, sometimes we're talking about 5 milliseconds here difference, right? It's not a great deal less, but it is less. The thing is, though, that's not the only thing to think about, okay? Because the location can limit your availability options, all right? It can also limit your hardware options. It just kind of depends. Some configurations are not available in all regions. So your east, your west, your south, and your north US are the ones that typically have all of the features. Don't take that as, complete truth, because you really have to start digging into certain options to say, oh, this is not available. And I think we've already seen it with storage. I had North Central US for my storage account, so I didn't have any availability options. Whereas when I choose the east region, then I have all of these options. So it can limit your options, and there are also price differences. All right, you will find that the price is different for the exact same virtual machine and compute resources depending on the region. So just think about that. It is dependent on your latency. However, because the differences in that latency are so minute, most of the time the deciding factor becomes, what am I trying to deploy? And just making sure that, okay, yes, what I'm trying to deploy is available in my preferred region. If it's not, then check to see if it's available in a secondary region. And we need to get familiar with the pricing options as well. There are two separate costs that the subscription is going to be charged for every VM, and that is compute cost and storage cost. So compute cost are priced on a per hour basis. However, they are billed on a per minute basis. So if you do shut down, stop, deallocate VMs, then you're not going to be charged. All right. It depends on the situation. A lot of times production VMs are running all the time, but we can set options so that even production VMs get turned off if they're unnecessary. I had an example of, basically an organization that needed this one application available, and they wanted it to be in the cloud for whatever reason. But when I started talking to the guy, we realized that he actually only uses this thing once or twice a month or a week. Okay, and he always does it about the same time. So we decided what that time was. It was 1 to 2 p.m. And I literally have this virtual machine starting every day during the week at 1 o'clock and then turning off at 3 o'clock. Okay, so it literally is running for 2 hours every day, and it's an automatic stop-start. All right, so anyway, that was kind of a side note. Don't mean to go on a rabbit trail, but the point is you are only going to be billed for what you use, even though it's priced. When you look at the proposed price, it is going to be based on hours, all right? And the hourly price is going to vary based on the VM size and based on the operating system that you select. So if you use a Windows operating system, then the price includes a charge for that, although we can use the Azure Hybrid benefit and utilize our own licenses, and that'll cut down on the cost. You can also pay ahead. Okay, so there are ways to cut down on that. But then you have storage cost. And so you're charged separately for the storage that the virtual machine uses. And the status of the VM, like whether it's turned off or on, has no relation to storage because you're still utilizing the storage. And so you can choose from two payment options for that consumption-based and reserved virtual machine instances. So consumption-based is pay for you go, or pay as you go by the second. All right, you pay for exactly what you use, and that's it. And you pay the full price. Reserved virtual machine instances is the advanced purchase option of up to 1 to 3 years in a specified region. Okay, so you are paying up front, but you get a massive price savings. Up to, depends on the specific resource, but up to about 75% potentially. Okay, so location has something to do with pricing. Obviously, virtual machine sizing has something to do with pricing. I don't believe this is something you have to memorize, but you can certainly go out and look at the documentation. So they have different series. Like, for instance, A series is entry level for development and test. B series is low traffic web servers, small databases, but still development and test, but they're burstable. D series is your general purpose compute. Okay, so this would be enterprise applications, relational databases, you name it, and you can choose the number of processors that you want, the amount of memory that you want. And then it just kind of goes on and on and on. All right. So you'll see that, as you're going through and taking a look at it, you're looking for two things, right? We need it to perform. And so in general, matching the on-premise counterparts is a good idea, a good place to start. You need it to perform, but you also want to kind of think of the cost, because you are paying for what you use on a monthly basis. So all of those things need to be kept in mind when we're designing virtual machines. In addition to that, let's talk a little bit more here on storage. So with virtual machines, you've got a virtual hard disk that you use to store operating systems, applications, data. All of your Azure virtual machines are going to have at least 2 disks. One is the Windows operating system disk, or just the OS disk, and another is a temporary disk. Okay. Now you can add additional data disk if you would like. So some of these are self-explanatory, right? The operating system disk has a pre-installed OS, and that was selected based on the template that you utilized when you created the VM. The temporary disk is not a managed disk, and it really is just short-term storage for applications and processes. It's actually intended only to store your virtual memory, your page or swap files. So don't store critical data on that. In fact, don't store any data on the temp drive, because during a standard reboot of the VM, the data should persist, but it might not, right? A temporary means temporary. Okay, so if you want to install applications and store stuff off of the operating system disk, then we would go in and create a data disk. That's a managed disk that's attached to a virtual machine to store whatever you want, and each disk has a maximum of 4 terabytes of size. Okay, the size of the virtual machine will determine how many disks that you can attach to it, but for the most part, there's not a whole lot of limits there. Managed versus unmanaged, we do need to make sure that we realize what the difference is. The original method with Azure was to use unmanaged disk. With an unmanaged disk, that means you manage the storage accounts that are used to store the VHD files, and they're stored as page blobs in that account. With a managed disk, you could think of it like a physical disk in an on-prem server, but it's virtualized. Okay, these disks are stored as page blobs. It is managed and called that way because there's an abstraction over the page blobs, the blob containers, the storage accounts. With managed disk, all you have to do is provision the disk, and then Azure just handles everything else. Okay. Now you still have the disk types of SSDs, premium SSD, standard SSD, standard hard disk drive. And then the latest one is the Ultra SSD. And so you should look into the particulars on those as to what type of disk you want. But managed versus unmanaged just means you don't actually have anything to do with the storage accounts. Supported operating systems, obviously Windows Server and Windows clients. The Windows 10 client, Windows Server, 2012 R2, 2016, and 2019. And then Linux. Okay, there are many distributions of Linux. CentOS, CoreOS, Debian Linux, Oracle Linux, Red Hat Enterprise, Ubuntu, All of those are distributions that are offered within Azure when you're creating virtual machines. And then how do we connect? Well, we connect depending on the version. So with Windows-based, you're going to connect with RDP. With Linux-based, you're going to connect typically using SSH, and most of the time that is through the use of PuTTY, which is a free open source terminal emulator. You can also use it to transfer files and whatnot. It supports several protocols, but SSH is predominantly the protocol that you would use to connect to a Linux system. Right? Speaking of RDP connections, I mean, you will get, by default, when you create a VM, we'll see that it wants to open up RDP, and then there's a warning about it. We never should leave RDP open from the internet. Okay, you need it so that you can connect and configure the system, but then we really should use network security groups or the Azure firewall to restrict where those connections are coming from. The source should not be any on your RDP connections, because that is a great way to get ransomware or any other sort of malicious activity on those virtual machines. All right, in this demonstration, we're going to help you look at the pricing calculator to understand how to size out virtual machines. This is very important for us to do as a part of the planning process, because we're in a pay-as-you-go environment. So we don't want to pay for too much. We don't want to pay for too little. We need to support our workloads in the cloud just like we would support them in a physical infrastructure. The difference is, this isn't a physical infrastructure, at least not one that you see and manage. You manage the virtual side of this because it is infrastructure as a service, and you pay for what you get. So we're going to need to do some pricing. We have to figure out what we need from the server first, and then we have to determine the options that we have in Azure. If you just search for pricing calculator, especially in Bing, Azure is going to be the first one that comes up. So this is azure.microsoft.com, ENUS/pricing/calculator. All right, pretty straightforward. You do not need to memorize this kind of stuff for the exam. This is really just to show you this is here. From a real world perspective, this is going to be how you scope out projects, for instance. Let's say you work like myself for an MSP, where an organization comes and says, well, this is what we would like to do. We'd like to move to the cloud. We have to evaluate workloads. We have to evaluate the current sizes. We have to look at current performance. We have to understand the organizational needs. And then we got to go to Azure and we have to say, okay, this is what we need to implement. But you can see compute, network, storage, web, mobile, databases, AI, IoT, basically everything that Azure is capable of doing is going to be in here. This is the pricing calculator. So we'll hit virtual machines just to kind of show you. It adds that to our views. So we just got to go over there and click view. I thought that I did. So we can see here, we have the ability to choose the region. So let's say East US, we're going to use the Windows operating system. What did you want? You can lump BizTalk and SQL Server into there, and then what kind of tier. Okay. Standard being the highest. Categories, instance series. So categories is going to let you automatically shoot to the correct kind of location. Let's just say general purpose. This is general purpose. What are the instance series? Now, all of these mean something, but you really have to go and kind of dig into the documentation to see the big differences between these. And that's not really necessary unless you're in a specific scenario where you have to do that, then you can do that at that time. It's not necessary to memorize them, is what I mean. We can just hit the drop down and you can see the large number that are there. So D series is your general purpose stuff. If we go to compute optimized, that's going to switch. Okay, so this is servers, and this is how much it's going to cost. So for a single processor core and only 2 gigs of RAM, that's what we need in the compute optimized category. In the high performance compute, now it's 8 cores, 56 gigs of RAM. And you can see there's a price difference. That one's $1 an hour. The other one was 5 cents an hour. And so you decide, storage optimized, memory optimized. Again, I'm just going to go back to general purpose. We're going to click our drop down. We've got all kinds of options. Let's choose the D series, and I'm going to say 2 virtual CPUs and 8 gigabytes of RAM. 10 cents an hour.